And that's the next feature, is around follow the energy. And it's about finding the right people to really bring energy to your idea, and to making sure that that idea happens. Tell me a little bit about that.
One of the things I oftentimes say to people when I'm coaching them is, be careful of the company you keep. If you're hanging out with people that are, whining and crying about somebody who's not in the circle right now, chances are they're a de-energizer. And chances are when you're not there, they're doing the same thing about you. But if you find those positive energizers and you really tap into the power of positive energy, I mean, it could create an incredible tipping point inside of an organization. And I can think of a couple of different illustrations of that. One of my favorite stories in the book is about an MBA study. And, it was a simulation, just a simple classroom simulation where groups were, responsible for basically negotiating compensation packages for given employees. But what they didn't know is different groups were seated with different types of behaviors. They had an actor, amongst them that no one knew about in the group. Those groups that had a negative actor that was really, sort of the naysayer, if you will, actually underperformed. Those groups that had positive actors, that were buzzing up the ideas and yes and in the ideas and challenging people to think about it from a different perspective, way outperformed the other groups. And most of the people inside the groups in the after action review had no clue. They were chalking it up to great negotiation strategies. In reality, on an ongoing basis, it had as much to do with the social climate and what was happening inside, that buzzed network than anything else. And I guess one other study real quickly, we've studied, what it looks like to put somebody into a toxic team. And if you drop somebody, even a high energy person, into a toxic team, their energy drops threefold almost immediately. But if you put them into a positive team, the opposite happens. They get lifted up and in fact, they feel like they can be their better self inside of the organization.
When we think about GM, we don't exactly think about GM as a global powerhouse of, adaptive space and innovation. But it's very clear that that's one of the things that you're doing in the organization. Tell us about that.
This whole concept of, bringing adaptive space to General Motors and trying to enact it inside of a fairly large, traditionally bureaucratic organization has just been a blast for me. And the reality is, the organization first had to become less insular, had to start thinking about, the future mobility in a much more radical way, had to start doing more discovery, like the book by Cadillac story I shared a few moments ago, but then had to create the adaptive space or the freedom within the organization for these social interactions to occur. So, I could tell all kinds of stories about how that happened. My two favorite are, GM 2020, and then also what we're doing with, self-driving, sort of the future mobility and self-driving vehicles. GM 2020 was completely organic. It was a grassroots initiative, where a group of people got together in 2014, small group of people got together in 2014 and asked a simple question. What would it look like if we positively disrupted the way we work? And they picked the year 2020 as sort of their milestone. And rather than, commissioning, a bold new strategy, they decided to act their way there. And through a series of small little actions, person by person, all local, almost all frontline, they were able to radically shift the way the organization thought about certain things, to the point where I think that first group gathered and there were about 50 people in the room. We just did an event, just a few weeks ago, and by volunteers only, over 1,000 people showed up, and it was sold out. Many other people would have liked to have been there, but the venue simply wouldn't hold that many people. So people get fired up and excited about new possibilities, and it can happen again in an organic way, much like that, or it can be in a much more structured way, like what we're doing with Cruise Automation, which is our future bet on self-driving vehicles. And that was an acquisition, first off, a small group of people out in Silicon Valley who, had some algorithms and knowledge about, what it looks like to build sensors for self-driving vehicles. But then we put them into a bunch of development teams, a series of small two-pizza teams. And in about 18 months, through a series of iterations, these small little teams were able to actually create 4 generations of self-driving technology to the extent that, in a very short time frame, you're going to see, commercial product out on the streets. The product's already there today, and it's collecting data on a day-to-day basis, but, in a very short time frame, you're going to see self-driving vehicles out on the streets, and that all happen through thinking about social configurations, thinking about bridging mechanisms, and how can you protect those entities until they stand up, because they're very fragile early days, and the mothership will strangle them out if you're not thoughtful. So keeping them slightly partitioned off, but not so partitioned off that they can't be pulled in and become the new core in some future move.